There is a letter that no one has ever read. It was written by John Lennon sometime in the mid 1970s, folded carefully, and placed in a drawer inside the Dakota apartment in Manhattan. It stayed there. It was never sealed. It was never addressed. It was never sent. The person it was written to, a man named Paul McCartney, who had once been the closest creative partner John Lennon would ever have, never knew it existed. Its exact contents remain unknown. What is known is that it was found among John's personal papers after his death in December 1980, still folded, still in the drawer, still carrying whatever it was that John had needed to say and had ultimately decided, for reasons he never explained to anyone, not to say. The story of why John Lennon wrote that letter, and why he chose not to send it, is the story of the most complicated creative relationship in the history of popular music. Two men who built something extraordinary together, tore it apart in public with a fury that shocked the world, spent years throwing words at each other through music and interviews and legal proceedings, and who were, underneath all of that noise, still reaching toward each other in ways neither could fully admit. It is a story about pride and grief and the particular loneliness that comes from losing someone who understood you before you understood yourself. And it begins not at the end, but at the beginning, in Liverpool, on a warm July afternoon in 1957, when a 16-year-old boy with a cheap guitar played a church fade and changed the course of music history without knowing it. The details of the afternoon John Lennon and Paul McCartney first met have been told so many times they have taken on the quality of mythology. John was performing with the Quarrymen at a church garden party in Woolton. Paul was 15, brought along by a mutual friend. He watched John play, and afterward in the church hall, someone made an introduction. They were two teenage boys in post-war Liverpool, both shaped by loss. John raised by his Aunt Mimi after being effectively abandoned by both parents, facing the death of his mother Julia the following year. Paul had lost his own mother Mary to cancer in 1956, just a year before this meeting. Neither of them knew how central that shared grief would become to what they built together. What Paul did that afternoon, the thing that would seal everything, was pick up a guitar and play. He played 20 Flight Rock from memory with a fluency that immediately told John something important. This boy was better than him. Not intimidation, not resentment, but a kind of hungry recognition. He needed this, whatever he was building, this was the piece it was missing. He asked Paul to join the Quarrymen a few weeks later. Paul said yes, and from that moment, something began between them that would take years to fully understand and a lifetime to fully lose. What followed is well documented and almost beyond comprehension in its scale. The years of obscurity in Liverpool and Hamburg, playing until their fingers bled in clubs that stayed open until dawn, the discovery by Brian Epstein, the signing to EMI. By 1964, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the most famous songwriters on the planet, their partnership producing music that the world would still be listening to 60 years later. But even inside the triumph, something was forming that would eventually become the fracture. John and Paul were two completely different kinds of creative intelligence that happened, in the specific context of the Beatles in the 1960s, to produce something neither could have made alone. John brought the raw edge, the literary instinct, the refusal to be comfortable. Paul brought melodic perfection, the instinct for arrangement, the discipline that turned John's rough brilliance into something a listener could inhabit. They completed each other in a way that was also inevitably a source of tension, because completion is not the same as equality. The Beatles did not fall apart suddenly. They fell apart the way relationships fall apart. Slowly, then all at once, the slow part invisible to everyone, including the people inside it. There were years of small fractures before the final break. The death of Brian Epstein in 1967, which removed the one person whose authority both John and Paul genuinely respected. The divergence of their artistic visions. The arrival of Yoko Ono and Linda Eastman. The business disputes that turned creative disagreements into legal warfare. But underneath all of the specific grievances, there was something more personal and more painful. John and Paul had grown up, emotionally, in the Beatles. They had met as teenagers and spent their entire adult formation inside the bubble of the band, under the constant pressure of global attention. They had never had a chance to become fully separate people before they were famous. And now that the band was ending, they were discovering that being fully separate people was harder than it had looked from inside the partnership. John left the Beatles first, in September 1969, though the announcement was delayed for months. Paul's public statement of departure in April 1970 was perceived as the official ending, and John resented Paul for getting the public narrative of the break. The bitterness that followed was real and fierce. John gave interviews in which he was cutting and sometimes brutal about Paul's music and character. Paul responded with his own interviews, his own coded messages and song. They were two men who had spent 15 years building something together, now engaged in the particular cruelty of people who know exactly where the other person is most vulnerable. The most extraordinary expression of this cruelty came through the music itself. John's 1971 song, How Do You Sleep, was a direct and devastating attack on Paul, its lyrics surgical in their precision, landing on the specific insecurities that only someone who had spent 15 years learning the exact shape of another person's self-doubt could target so accurately. Paul heard it. The world heard it. The wound it opened was visible and deep. But here is what the public record tends to obscure. John was not only angry, he was also devastated. The anger was real, but it was the kind of anger that only has that surgical, intimate precision when it comes from grief. He was attacking someone whose loss he had not yet found a way to process. The attack, for all its apparent confidence, was itself a form of reaching, terrible, destructive, ultimately futile, but reaching nonetheless. The years between 1970 and 1975 were turbulent for John Lennon in ways that are well documented. The political activism, the immigration battles with the Nixon administration, the separation from Yoko in late 1973, the period he would call his lost weekend, which lasted 18 months, spent largely in Los Angeles, which he would later describe, with the honesty that was one of his most consistent and costly qualities, as one of the lowest periods of his life. In Los Angeles, John was surrounded by people but genuinely alone in the way that only fame can produce. Recognized everywhere, known by almost no one, he was drinking too much, making decisions he would later regret, actively unhappy beneath the performance of someone who did not want to appear so. And during this period, something surprising happened. John and Paul began tentatively and without announcement to communicate again, not the public warfare of interviews and coded songs, something quieter. Phone calls, a visit. May Pang, John's companion during the separation, has spoken carefully about this, suggesting that John talked about Paul more than his public posture of detachment would have indicated, not always kindly, but with a consistency that suggested the armor was covering something real. There was reportedly an evening in Los Angeles in early 1974 when Paul came to see John informally, and the two men spent several hours playing music together. Just the two of them, the way they had not done since before the Beatles ended. No cameras, no handlers. Just two men in a room with guitars, doing the thing that had brought them together in a Liverpool church hall 17 years earlier. The accounts are fragmentary and come from secondhand sources. But what is consistent across them is that something in the room shifted. Something that had been closed began briefly to open. And then it closed again. Because pride is a powerful force, and the habits of public performance, of being John Lennon, who was famously at war with Paul McCartney, had become, after 5 years, harder to simply set aside than an evening of music could dissolve. John returned to New York and to Yoko in early 1975. Sean was born in October of that year. John entered the long withdrawal from public life that would last until 1980, and somewhere in that period he wrote the letter. What is known about the letter comes from people who were close to John during the Dakota years. The letter was handwritten, significant because John typed most of his correspondence by the mid-1970s. It was not short, several pages by one account. The handwriting described by someone who saw it without reading it in full was not the loose, fast scrawl of John's usual written communication. It was deliberate, considered, the handwriting of someone choosing each word with unusual care. What did it say? No one has said definitively. What is suggested is that the letter addressed the dissolution of the Beatles with the honesty that John's public statements had never achieved, that it acknowledged the things John had said and done that he was not proud of, that it described what the partnership had meant to him in terms he had never been willing to use in public, because using them would have required a vulnerability he had never been able to perform without armor. And it is suggested that the letter was in some essential way an apology, not a complete capitulation, but an acknowledgement that the way he had expressed his position, the how do you sleep of it, the interview attacks, the public surgical wounding of someone he had once loved as a brother, had been something he regretted, that whatever the genuine grievances were, they did not justify what John had done with them. He wrote it, he folded it, he put it in the drawer, and then, for reasons he never explained to anyone who has spoken about it since, he left it there. The question of why John Lennon did not send the letter is in some ways unanswerable. He is not here to explain it. Paul McCartney, who did not know the letter existed, cannot explain it. The people who were around John can offer only partial and speculative answers. But there are things that can be said. John Lennon was a man of enormous creative courage, but also a man who had been emotionally abandoned early in life in ways that made particular kinds of vulnerability genuinely terrifying. His mother Julia had left him, his father Alfred had left him. That pattern had shaped, in the deep structural way that early experiences shape a person, his relationship with exposure. He could be nakedly honest in his music, devastatingly candid in interviews, but those forms of honesty operated at a remove, through a microphone, through a recording, through performance. A handwritten letter sent directly to Paul McCartney was a different kind of exposure. It had no remove, it was just John on paper saying, I was wrong about some of this. I am sorry, I miss what we had. That is a terrifying thing to send to someone who might not receive it well, who might use it, who might share it, who might, worst of all, simply not respond in kind. John had spent 5 years becoming quieter and more inward, becoming the kind of person who could say what mattered without performance. But becoming that person did not automatically dissolve the fear that had always been underneath the performance, and the fear of being exposed and not received, of reaching and finding nothing reaching back, may have been more than John was ready to risk in the years between his return to New York and his death in 1980. There is also this. The phone calls continued. The relationship between John and Paul in the late 1970s was warmer than the public record suggests. Paul has described the pleasure of those calls, two old friends talking about ordinary things, music and children and the particular shared history that no one else on earth could fully access. Maybe the letter felt unnecessary. Maybe what needed to be said was already being said, in fragments, in the gaps between what two old friends talk about when they call each other on the phone. Or maybe he simply ran out of time. Paul McCartney has been, over the decades since John's death, more open about the complexity of the relationship than the mythology of the Beatles sometimes allows. He has acknowledged the difficulty of the dissolution years, the things said publicly and privately that caused genuine pain. He has spoken with a care that suggests the subject is still not fully processed even after more than 40 years, about what John meant to him. Not just as a collaborator, but as someone Paul loved in the particular way you love someone who was present at the formation of everything you became. What Paul did not know in the years after John's death was the letter. He did not know that John had written it. He did not know it was in the drawer. He did not know that somewhere in the Dakota among John's personal papers there was a handwritten document that contained the things John had not been able to say in any other form. When Paul learned of the letter's existence, and the accounts of when and how are incomplete, the response was not public. What can be said is that the knowledge of the letter's existence did not make the grief simpler. If anything, it complicated it, because the letter confirmed what Paul had perhaps suspected, but could not know for certain, that the distance between them in those final years was not the whole truth, that underneath it was something John had tried to address, had gotten to the point of writing down, and had then chosen not to send. The letter in the drawer is not a tragedy of silence exactly. The calls were happening. The warmth was real. But the letter represents something the calls could not fully deliver. The formal acknowledgement, in John's own hand, that what they had built together was the most important creative relationship of both their lives, and that John at the end understood this fully. In 1971, the same year John released How Do You Sleep, Paul released Dear Friend on his Wings Wild Life album, addressed directly and transparently to John. The lyrics were plain and aching. Are you afraid, or is it real? A man asking another man if the anger between them was genuine or performed. A man saying, I miss you. John never publicly responded to Dear Friend. He did not acknowledge it in interviews. But those who were around him when the album was released suggest that he heard it and understood exactly what Paul was doing. And he said nothing publicly, because saying something publicly would have required him to match Paul's vulnerability, and he was not in 1971 ready to do that. The music told the story that the people could not tell directly. Jean's solo work throughout the 1970s contains, if you listen for it, a thread of longing not entirely about Yoko or Sean or political causes. There is something else in certain songs, the isolation of certain lyrics, the searching quality of certain performances, that reads like a man who has lost something he cannot name in polite company and is trying, through the only language he has ever fully trusted, to work through what that loss means. He never finished working through it. The drawer held the letter, the phone calls continued, and then December 1980 came and the chance to send the letter, or to burn it, or to finally pick up the phone and say the things the letter contained was gone. Paul McCartney learned of John's death on the evening of December 8th, 1980, and his response, captured by a journalist present, became one of the most discussed moments of his public life. He said, simply, that it was a drag. The words were received badly by many who found them inadequate to the scale of the loss. Paul has explained since that he was in shock, that the words came out before he had access to what he was actually feeling, that underneath them was something bearing no resemblance to inadequacy. What Paul has said in subsequent years is that losing John the way he lost him, suddenly, at a point when the relationship had been warming but before it had fully repaired, produced a particular kind of grief with no clean edges, the things that had not been said, the letter in the drawer, the ordinary phone calls of two old friends that simply stopped one evening without warning, or the chance to say anything meaningful at all. He wrote a song for John called Here Today, released in 1982. Not a grand tribute, a quiet song in which Paul speaks directly to John in the second person about the specific things they shared, the humor, the way they understood each other's references, the particular quality of a friendship built in youth and carried through everything. The language is understated in the way that true grief is sometimes understated. When the feeling is too large for gesture, the smallest words are the only ones that fit. Here Today is in some ways the answer to the letter John never sent. It is Paul saying in music the things that two proud men could never quite find a way to say directly to each other, an acknowledgement that what they had was irreplaceable, that the person who had understood him before he fully understood himself was gone, and the world was permanently altered by that going. The white piano and the letter in the drawer are perhaps the two most evocative private objects in John Lennon's story. The piano produced the most widely shared thing he ever made. The letter contained the most private thing. Both represent the same fundamental tension that ran through his entire creative life, the tension between the impulse to share and the impulse to protect. The piano won, the letter did not. What the letter represents, sitting folded in its drawer, is not only the unfinished business between two men, it represents something more universal, the things we mean to say to the people who matter most, and the thousand small reasons, pride, fear, the assumption that there will be more time, that keep us from saying them. John Lennon was not a timid man. He spent his career saying uncomfortable things in public, with a directness that cost him and that he paid without complaint. But this one thing, this folded document addressed to Paul McCartney, he could not send. Maybe the gap between what we can create and what we can directly offer to the people we love is simply part of the condition of being human. Maybe the same qualities that made John Lennon's voice carry further than almost any other, the way he had learned to speak through music rather than directly, also made it harder for him to close the distance between himself and the specific person who had been there at the beginning. Paul McCartney is in his 80s now. He still performs, still plays Lennon-McCartney songs in stadiums. When he reaches the parts that John wrote or the parts that John sang, the audiences understand that something specific is happening. A man keeping his promise to a voice that stopped, a man continuing a conversation that was not finished. The letter remains wherever it is, perhaps with Yoko, perhaps with Sean, perhaps in an archive somewhere, still folded, still unread by the person it was written for. The phone calls happened and cannot unhappen. Here Today exists. The music they made together exists, and will continue to exist past any reasonable horizon of time. What the letter in the drawer ultimately teaches is not about regret alone, nor simply about the things left unsaid. It is about something more fundamental, the way that the people we love most are sometimes the ones we find hardest to speak to directly. The way that intimacy and pride and fear can combine to create a silence around the most important things, even when we know the silence is there, even when we pick up the pen and write the words and fold the paper and put it in the drawer. John Lennon wrote the letter, he meant every word, he just never sent it. And Paul McCartney, who knew John Lennon better than almost anyone alive, spent 40 years playing their music together on stages around the world, saying in the only language they had both always trusted, the language of sound and melody and lyric, what the letter would have said if it had found its way out of the drawer and into the world. The song is still going, the drawer is still closed, and somewhere between those two things is the whole story of what it means to love someone you built your life with and lose them before the account between you is fully settled. John knew it, Paul knows it, the rest of us listening know it too.